Happy Sabbath. You know, this is, believe it or not, this is the first time that I've done a sermon, so I'm excited about that. Pastor Mike's not here today. I was walking into the foyer there, and Don mentioned, "Hey, we got to hear you talk." Or he said, "Who's preaching?" I said, "Yeah, I'm preaching." And Don said, "No, you're not preaching. God's preaching." Well put. So let's have a word of prayer. Dear Lord, I pray that you would preach today, exactly that, and that each of us could get something special from the message today. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So the title of my sermon here today is After God's Heart, Lessons from David. Essentially what I've done is look at 3 or 4 scenarios in David's life and then try and pick out, 5 or 6 points that we can take and learn from that. So the first one I want to talk about is just David and Goliath. Before I read this verse, I want to give you kind of the context of what's going on here. So you have the two armies, the Philistines and the Israelites. They're pitted one against each other. And Goliath has come out, and he's kind of taunted Israel. He's looking at them, and, who is your God? None of you can come out here and fight me. You claim to serve this great God, and yet not one of you has the strength to come out. What kind of God is that? So he's taunting the name of God. David just happens to wander into the camp. Remember, he was getting the bread for the commanders and the cheeses for his brother. And that's where we pick up this verse. It says in 1 Samuel 17, 23 to 26, David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So the first thing I want you to notice is kind of the tone here. David's angry. It pricks his heart because here's this Philistine, this uncircumcised Philistine, and he's mocking, he's taunting his God, the very God that he had spent time with in the pasture, the very God that he knew. And it pricks him to its heart. But he doesn't just stop there. He asks, what's going to be done about this? What are we going to do about this disgrace? You see the question here. What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? So the first thing that the first point that I want to make is this. David stood up for God. Amen. Psalms 94:16 says, "Who will rise for me against the wicked? Who will take a stand for me against evildoers?" It's an important question. I think it's something that we need to ask ourselves. Will we stand up for the name of God? What do you do when someone takes the name of the Lord in vain? Does it prick you to your heart? G-O-D, dang it. J-C. Does it hurt you? It should hurt you. Then the next question is, what do you do about it? It pricked David to his heart. But he did something. He asked, what are we going to do about this disgrace? Excuse me, sir. You just took the name of my Lord in vain. I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't do that. I'd appreciate it if you would respect my God. Thank you very much. It almost sounds funny to say something like that because you just don't see it happen. But that's the passion David had for his God, and it's definitely something we can learn. Psalms 119, 41 to 42 says, "Let your steadfast love come to me, O Lord, your salvation according to your promise. Then shall I have an answer for him who taunts me, for I trust in your word." What does this say about how we will have an answer for him who taunts me or taunts the Lord? It is our love. Look what it says there. Whoops, sorry. Your steadfast love come to me, O Lord, your salvation to your promise. Then shall I have an answer for him who taunts me. So it was the love David had for his God that gave him this oomph to say something. you know. Philippians 1:16, the latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. Again, this just further iterates that it's love that compels us to defend our faith. You know, the story goes on here in 1 Samuel 17:32, and it says, David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. And then a little bit farther down, 1 Samuel 17:36-37, your servant has killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. So again, kind of looking at the context here, he's been pricked to the heart, right? But he doesn't just stop there. He's asking the question, what's going to be done? And what's the answer that he gets? Chirp, chirp, crickets, right? Nobody wants to go out and fight. So David takes it one step farther. He says, I'll go fight the Philistine. I'll put my life on the line to defend the name of my God. You know, and for David, well, let me get to my second point here first, then I'll hit that. So this is the second point. David trusted and had faith in God. You know, for David, he had spent time with God in the pasture. You know, he had defended his sheep from the lion and the bear. It even says that. Your servant has killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. To David, Goliath was just another beast that he needed to take down. He had been with God. He had seen what God had done in his life, saving the sheep from the lion and bear. It was basically just like another day in the pasture, you know? Another day where God's going to be here to defend me. Another day where he's going to give me the victory. You know, we can't have that type of, I guess you can almost say, calmness unless we've had that close faith and that close relationship with God that he's worked in our lives to the point where we can trust in him. David had such trust and faith in God. First John 4:18 says there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. You know, you look at, it must have been a very difficult situation for David. You know, I mean, putting your life on the line, it's definitely a situation that, you know, commands fear. And, you know, looking at the situation, all these other men, they had too much fear to step out and go face the giant. The difference between David, obviously, and these other men was that he had the love of God in his heart, because it's perfect love that casts out fear. It's kind of the same way as if you had a loved one in a burning building, and you just kind of run in there. You know, it's that love that drives you to do great things. Perfect love casts out fear. Deuteronomy 31:6 says, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave nor forsake you." You know, it's amazing what God will accomplish through us if we step out in faith. But what does it say there? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, because the Lord is with you. We have to have that faith and that trust to let God work through us. And we are capable of such amazing things, such bigger things that we're probably even can think of. Again, David had that faith. He was just a boy. He wasn't even an army man. And yet he went out there, first shot with the sling of the stone, he dispelled the giant. He had the creator of the entire universe on his side. So do we. You know, it's kind of funny to think about it, that the God who created All the universe is on our side to help us through our difficult times. What are we afraid of then? Psalms 118:6, the Lord is with me, I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? What can mere mortals do to me? So often we ask that question. You know, it may be at your job. It may just be getting humiliated for speaking up, standing for God. But what's it say there? The Lord is with me. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? Maybe there's a temporary effect, but in the end, God's got your back. We have nothing to be afraid of. I like this verse. 1 Samuel 17:45. David said to the Philistine, You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. I mean, what confidence. What was Goliath's weapon? It was his spear, his javelin, his experience as a warrior, this great warrior, this huge man. What does it say David's weapon was? Was it his sling and his stone? Well, you could kind of say that, but what was his greater weapon? You come at me with spear and javelin, I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel. We can do such great things with God in our court. Okay, so I want to get to the next story here. So this is David dancing before the ark. 2 Samuel 6:14-17. But as the ark of the Lord entered the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked down from her window. When she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she was filled with contempt for him. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside a special tent David had prepared for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and peace offerings to the Lord. Continues here in 20-22. When David returned home to bless his own family, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet him. She said in disgust, How distinguished the king of Israel looked today, shamelessly exposing himself to servant girls, like any vulgar person might do. David retorted to Michal, I was dancing before the Lord, who chose me above your father and all his family. He appointed me as leader of Israel, the people of the Lord, to celebrate. So I celebrated before the Lord. Yes, I am willing to look even more foolish than this, even humiliated in my own eyes. So, kind of to paint the picture here, give you a little context. The ark has been out of Jerusalem for a while. It's finally coming back to Jerusalem. There's this parade, going down Main Street of Jerusalem, and David is out in front dancing before the Lord. But it's not an ordinary situation because he's dressed kind of in raggy clothes. He's kind of flailing his arms, I guess you could say. And his wife is up above, looking down, not approving of what is going on. She's humiliated. So why? What's the point of this? Why was David doing this? It was this. This is why. David wanted to become as undistinguished as possible to show that reputation did not matter to him in comparison with how much God mattered to him. Let me say that one more time. David wanted to become as undistinguished, or foolish, you could say, as possible. Boy, I didn't advance the slide there, sorry. To show that reputation, his reputation, which was a great reputation, did not matter in comparison with how much God mattered to him. So that gets to the third point that I want to make here. David was not ashamed of God. Galatians 1:10 states, For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. David was certainly not trying to have man's approval. I mean, That was kind of the point here. He was wearing these undistinguished clothes in order to make himself less. He wanted to show that his reputation, which was so great, it didn't matter. He didn't care what other people thought. The point was that he wanted to worship with all his heart and show people that that is the one thing that mattered. I mean, he could have come into that procession in kingly clothes. He could have come in his military uniform. I mean, you think of today, it's kind of funny if you were to think of a politician doing the same thing, dancing wildly in raggedy clothes down Pennsylvania Avenue. Doesn't make sense, right? That's kind of what David did here, because he's showing all this reputation that I've built up. It's nothing. I don't want you to look at my reputation. I don't want you to look at me. I want you to look at my worship of God. And so are we trying to seek the approval of our peers? Or are we trying to seek the approval of God? Think of this. This is a tough one to swallow at times, but think of this. How would you react if some of the things that you've done in secret was exposed to your peers? And yet those things are exposed to God all the time. God sees all that you do. It's kind of an eye-opener, but I think at times we're more concerned what other people think about us rather than God. Romans 1:16 says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." Sometimes we think a Christian, you have this picture of like the goody two-shoe Christian, you know. He's not. You take him out to the baseball game, and all he wants to do is talk to you about God, you know. Or he's one of these guys who witnesses. Our society tells us that that's not a man. That's a whatever, not a strong person. But that's incorrect. I mean, those who stand up for God, those are the true men. We are not to be ashamed. Romans 1:16 says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God." Matthew 10:32-33. "So everyone who acknowledges me before men, I will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. Whoever denies me..." Sorry, I didn't advance it. "So everyone who acknowledges me before men, I will acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny before my Father in heaven." This is a powerful verse. You know, one that we should not take lightly. We are not to disown God. We are to be proud to be Christians, proud to be children of the Father. Same story of dancing in front of the ark. This is the fourth point that I wanted to make about how what David can teach us in his life. And that is that David gave genuine worship to God. Psalms 102:4 says, "Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful song. Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving, and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him, and praise his name." You know, David, I want to go back here real quick to the verses that we were looking at here. So starting there in verse 21. David retorted to Michal, "I was dancing before the Lord, who chose me above the father and his family. He appointed me as leader of Israel, the people of the Lord. So I celebrated before the Lord. Yes, I am willing to even look more foolish than this, even humiliated in my own eyes." So it was thanksgiving that gave David this desire to worship. So, you know, and I don't think he was worshiping to be seen. I think he was worshiping from his heart. Whatever his heart felt that he should do, he did it. He was excited, about the ark coming back. Here was this God. Here was his father, the one who he knew. And now the presence of God was coming, back to Jerusalem. And he was so thankful for all that God had done for him. He had now appointed him king of Israel. And he had liberated him in his military campaigns. David gave genuine worship of thanksgiving to God. Similarly, we ought to be thankful in our worship. Hebrews 12:28. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving that cannot be shaken, and let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe. What's it say there? Reverence and awe. When we come together here, this is our time to be able to worship corporately with God. When we sing the songs and the music. And we ought to not take it lightly. It should be with reverence and awe. Not thinking about perhaps, why is this song 5 stanzas long? Or, the smell of the potluck starts to creep into the room, and, that takes over our attention. But sing out to God. This is your chance together as a group to give your best to God. Psalms 95:2 says, let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. Make a joyful noise with songs of praise. Sing to God. When you worship, don't just say the words, but talk to him. Like in that song, As the Deer, Lord, as that deer over there is pantething the water, my soul just longs for you. It should be not just mouthing the words, but singing to God. That's what worship is all about. Isaiah 12:5 says, sing praises to the Lord, for he has done gloriously. Let this be made known in all the earth. Let it be made known in all the earth. Whether you worship, by raising your hands, whether you worship in the quietness of, your heart, it doesn't really matter. What God's looking for is true worship from the heart. That's what David did. He worshiped with all his heart. He didn't care what other people thought. Sometimes the thought is, I don't know if I want to raise my hand. People are going to judge me. I'm not saying you have to raise your hand. For some people, they get more worship. They get more feeling from the heart just by quietly worshiping. And some people, they're sitting there and they want to raise their hand, but they're just afraid. The point is, it doesn't matter whether you raise your hand or don't raise your hand. What matters is, whatever you do it from the heart, and don't care what other people think about it. Okay, so let's go to the next story, which is David sparing Saul's life. So here's the verse. It says, so David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul lying asleep in the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and the soldiers were lying around him. Abishai said to David, today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground. With one thrust of my spear, I won't strike him twice. But David said to Abishai, don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, he said, the Lord himself will strike him. Either his time will come, or he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now get the spear in the water jug near his head, and let's go. So I think everybody kind of knows this story, putting it in context, right? Saul is chasing David, trying to kill him and his army. David and his army are continually fleeing from the hand of Saul. Saul goes down into the camp. His army and him are sleeping. And David says, who will go with me down into the camp? And Abishai volunteers, so David and Abishai go down there in somewhat of this courageous act. And the Lord puts a deep sleep over Saul, and he's able to get right over him to where he basically has Saul in his hand. Abishai's got the spear, and he can kill him. And David says, hold on a second. Don't do that. That is the Lord's anointed. So that brings me to my fifth point, and that is that David feared and obeyed God. You know, it was probably a tough decision for David to make. I'm sure it doesn't record in the Bible, but I'm sure there were short-term repercussions for having let Saul go. Perhaps his men, didn't approve of it. What are we doing out here? Are we not in a battle here? You let the guy go. I mean, that would have solved the problem, so to say, if you dispel Saul. Obviously, there was kind of the short-term repercussion. Man, this guy's going to still be after me, right? I didn't do away with him. But instead, he makes the difficult decision, and he upholds the anointed of the Lord. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths." It must have been it must have seemed logical to David at the time, right? To do what to go his own way, to do what he thought was right. He was reasoning in his head all these things the good things that would come by doing away with Saul. Sometimes we do the same. We reason, we have the logical idea that if I do it this way, I know better than God. God, you don't see everything, right? If I do it this way, my problems go away. I don't see the negative here. But what does this verse say? Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him. So David didn't quite see the reason or the result of why God wanted him to not strike the Lord's anointed. But he did it anyway. He made that decision. And in the end, what's it say here? He will make your paths. God exalted David because if you remember, Saul woke up and he admitted that David was more righteous than he. And I'm sure that David's men, learned a powerful lesson from that. That if you trust in God, if you put him first, he'll watch over you. And that's one of the reasons I'm sure his men followed him, because they knew that David was always going to make the right decision. Psalms 34:9 says, "Fear the Lord, you his holy people. For those who fear him lack nothing." Just another verse here about fearing and trusting God. Psalms 115:11. "You fear the Lord, trust in the Lord. He is their help and their shield." If we fear him, if we obey him, he will be our shield. Peter 3:14 says, "But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened." Again, we kind of hit on this, but, in the short term, it's tough at times to make the difficult situation. There will be suffering. But what does it say? Even if you suffer, you are blessed. So in the long run, David was blessed. God admitted that, David was more righteous. So we ought to do that, make those tough decisions at times. The right decisions. And then this one, so whoever does, this is James 4:17, so whoever knows the right thing and to do and fails to do it, for him is sin. Even a kind of a heavy verse there, that if we fail to do what is right, if we know it in our hearts and yet we fail to do that, we go our own way, James says, then that is sin. Okay, so the last one that I want to talk about here, the last scenario, is the story of David eating the showbread. And this one, I don't have the verse up there. Sorry about that. But anyway, David answered Ahimelech the priest, "The king sent me on a mission and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about the mission I am sending you on. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, What do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever you can find. But the priest answered David, I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women. David replied, Indeed, women have been kept from us, as usual, whenever I set out. The men's body are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today? So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. So, again, context of the story, Saul and his men are chasing David's army. David and his men, they're running out of food. They get tired. They stop at this house of God where Abimelech the priest is. He doesn't have any regular bread to feed his men. All he has is the holy bread. And so David makes the decision, give me the holy bread. My men need to eat. In other words, David chose love over legalism. So this was kind of like an ordinance, right? That they weren't to eat the holy bread, but his men needed food, and his love for his men was greater than what the ordinance was. Matthew 12, 3-4, Jesus speaking here, speaks of this situation. Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God. He and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priest. And then it jumps down a little bit in Matthew 7. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. You see, God is not interested in sacrifices and these ordinance, way of living. He's more interested in our heart. It's more important that we show mercy, right? Mercy to our fellow men. It says right there, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. David had mercy and love for his men. Micah 6:6 through 8 states it this way, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Look at all these sacrifices. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, 10,000 rivers of olive oil? It's a lot of olive oil. Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? I mean, there's some massive, expensive sacrifices. What does he say to that? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require you? To act justly, love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So it is mercy, love, justice, humility, these type of things that come from the heart is what God is more interested in. 1 Corinthians 16:14 says, let all that you do be done in love. I mean, this is a powerful verse. It's short, but very important. I think of a situation, hypothetical, of course, where maybe a friend calls you and wants to meet with you at a bar on the Sabbath. That's a tough situation. Well, you'd have to think about that situation because maybe that friend, maybe he's in the bar every night. And the loving thing to do is say, no, I'm not going to meet you at the bar, but I'll tell you what, I'll meet you at the park. We can talk things over. But then again, then maybe that's a different friend, and he says, I want to meet in the bar. But that friend, he doesn't meet. He's not a drinking type. He just wants somewhere to sit down to be able to talk things through, in his life. And so maybe then the loving thing to do is, yeah, I'll meet you there. But, whether you meet there or don't meet there, that's not the point. I mean, that's for your decision. And, God will put that conviction in your heart as to whether you're to do it or not. The important thing is right here. Let all that you do be done in love. Love for your fellow man and love for God. Matthew 22:37-40 says, Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law of the prophets hang on these two commandments. I mean, this is so important. Let us not be so dogmatic about rules. I mean, the commandments, obviously, those are important, and we need to follow those. But other things on the Sabbath, listen to your heart. Listen to what the Holy Spirit is convicting you. Let everything stem from a heart of love for God and for your fellow man. Okay, so that's the situation. So I just want to kind of recap each of these six situations. So the first one we talked about was David stood up for God. Goliath was taunting the name of the Lord. It pricked him to his heart, but he didn't just stop there. He asked, what's going to be done with this? He took a little bit of action. Number 2, David trusted and had faith in God. He had faith because he had been with God in the pasture. He had seen what God had worked through his life. The more we get to know somebody, the more we trust them, the more we have faith in him. So get to know God more. Number 3, David was not ashamed of God. He didn't care what other people thought as he was dancing before the Lord. He made his reputation nothing so that people could see that the thing that mattered most to him was his relationship with God. He gave genuine worship to God. Again, dancing before the ark. It came from a heart. He worshiped in thankfulness to God for all that God had done for him. He feared and obeyed God. He didn't make the easy decision. He didn't make the logical decision. He made the decision that God wanted him to make. And he chose love over legalism. Again, he looked at his fellow man, and it was more important to have mercy and love and to act in love above the ritualistic things. So all 6 of these have something in common. And I mean, we've kind of hit on it throughout the sermon, and I think you can probably figure out the one last point that I want to make about David. Without this last thing, none of these would be possible. All these are possible through one thing that David did better than anything else. And that was this. David knew God and David loved God. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." We ought to grow in our relationship with God, have that close connection to him. If we have that, God will take care of the rest. Acts 13:22, "And when he had removed him, he raised up unto him David to be their king, to whom he also gave their testimony and said, I have found David the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, which shall fulfill all my will." Because he loved God. And we too, as men and women, as Christians, can be, men and women after God's own heart if we too make God the center of our lives. Let us strive to do that, to have a closer relationship with our God.